Today, I would like to take a fresh look at the interplay of Lurianic Kabbalah and early modern science. Previous scholarship offers a variety of appraisals. Lurianism, having long been portrayed as an obscurantist doctrine, has more recently been interpreted as downright quasi-scientific. Moreover, early modern scientists have been shown to have had no little interest in this lore. The extent, rather than the simple fact, of its impact on the scientific revolution is what is now contested in recent scholarship. As an early modernist with an abiding interest in Kabbalah as well as the history of science, I've long been interested in this historiography. Interest is probably too lukewarm a term. I'm a fan. If I couldn't be a Sholem in my relative youth, I would have settled for being a little Jewish Yates. In short, I'm an admirer of this historiography, and as I reviewed it in preparation for today's presentation, my admiration grew. That said, I hope to point to possibilities for further refining our thinking on this issue and to explore the potential contribution my current research might make to a now venerable historiographical tradition. I want to begin by making a general point that has unfortunately not been sufficiently clear to scholars working on the Lurianic Kabbalah science question. This point is twofold. Firstly, whenever one works on Lurianic Kabbalah, it is vital that one distinguish between different internal or Jewish stages in its history. There is Luria's thought, which itself has been stratified in the historiography, its representations or representations by Vital and other students, and its reception and the reformulations and representations of subsequent generations. Secondly, when one works on topics in the history of science, it is vital that one be clear about what science meant in the particular place and time under scrutiny. Sophisticated practitioners of the history of science have long since abandoned an ahistoric, essentialized notion of science in favor of an approach that takes as its objective to disclose the ways in which science has been variously constructed through discursive practices in their socio-political contexts. In short, the term science is an historical variable rather than a constant and must be treated as such. To complicate matters, the period of the emergence and reception history of Lurianism in its first long century, roughly from the mid-16th to the late 17th centuries, coincides with perhaps the most dramatic, dazzling, and often baffling period in the history of Western science. Neither Lurianism nor science meant in 1570 what they would in 1700. When we explore their interrelations from an historical perspective rather than from a strictly phenomenological one, precision with regard to each variable is vital to the avoidance of specious and anachronistic arguments, as well as to the facilitation of fresh insights. Perspectives from Kabbalah studies. Although the question of the impact of Lurianism on early modern science is largely associated with the pioneering work of Warburg early modernists, scholars of Kabbalah have themselves explored the ways in which Lurianism might be construed as scientific. Some 20 years ago, in the proceedings of the Fourth International Conference on the History of Jewish Mysticism, Joseph Dan and Karl Grützinger published essays that took up this question from different perspectives. Dan and Grützinger both present Lurianic thought as novel in its structural coherence. Dan argues that the more personal and mythic character of earlier Kabbalah is replaced in Lurianism with a mathematical structural principle. Yehuda Liebes's probing article, Myth versus Symbol in Zohar and Lurianic Kabbalah, dating from the same period, makes a parallel argument but contrasts an earlier symbolic period with the myth of Lurianism. For Liebes, however, the mythic nature of Lurianism means that descriptions of divinity are one-to-one. The divine realm may be known and described directly, like any other object of consciousness, with the clarity of a mathematical structural principle. In Dan's view, the divine in Luria operates scientifically in that it obeys a constant and consistent law of emanation replication. Grützinger, in a complementary essay, identifies two logical principles that underlie Lurianism: a dependence upon physics and mathematics, including human anatomy, and the fractal, although he doesn't use the term, principle of aspects. The first principle is shown to rely on terms taken from natural science and the evidence of the senses to explain the cosmology. The second is deployed in order to enable a presentation of a world of plurality without compromising the basic axiom according to which nothing exists but the light of Ein Sof. As I've said, when exploring the connection between Lurianism and science, the meaning of the latter term is no less important to clarify than that of the former. What do these Kabbalah scholars mean by science? For Grötzinger, Lurianism is scientific in its empirical and sensory foundations. In this reading, cosmological principles derive from what we know about ourselves and the world through experience. For Dan, the scientific character of Lurianism is to be found in its presentation as a unified, totalizing theory, and in its rigorous and absolute commitment to a single structural law of development that begins with Ein Sof and concludes with matter. Dan repeatedly compares Luria to the father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel, though perhaps Watson and Crick, with their endlessly replicating double helix, would have been more apt. If Dan's definition of science is ahistoric, scientific thought seeks axiomatic principles that have broad explanatory value, he also notes the assimilation of medieval scientific terminology in Lurianism. Despite the assimilation, however, it was the scientific terminology that retained its original valence, claims Dan, rather than the Kabbalistic terminology with which it was equated. Kabbalistic terms were thus purged of personal mythic content as they were situated in a structural system that was the natural home of medieval scientific concepts. It cannot be denied that these essays take a largely essentialist, ahistoric approach to Lurianism and science alike. None mention the possible relevance of the 16th century context, nor do they problematize the distinction between the teachings of Luria and their subsequent representations. Nevertheless, they succeed in suggesting why early modern scientists might have found something strangely familiar in this arcana. The Warburg School. That scientific revolutionaries should have taken an interest in Kabbalah is hardly obvious. The bewildering arcana of Lurianism seem as utterly random and incomprehensible as the intricacies of astrophysics to the uninitiated. In 1975, a young Alison Couder, still an American in London working under Dame Frances Yates at the Warburg Institute, published A Cambridge Platonist Kabbalist Nightmare, in which she articulated an explanatory thesis that has been at the heart of her work ever since. Francis Mercury von Helmont and Baron Christian Noor van Rosenroth, as well as to varying extents 17th century natural philosophers who knew them or their work, from Henry Moore and Joseph Glanville to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Isaac Newton, they took a keen interest in Lurianic Kabbalah because of its optimistic character. In Couder's reckoning, based at this stage on her reading of Scholem, though later supplemented by Edel's New Perspectives, Luria's doctrine taught universal salvation as it was based on the premise of God's supreme attributes being love and goodness. Moreover, salvation would be achieved not by divine grace, but by collective human effort, tikkun. Lurianism thus supplied the perfect ethos for the scientific revolution, empowering humanity in the quest for progress. I should like to supplement rather than replace Couder's thesis by attending to features in specific expressions of Lurianism that facilitated their adoption by these intellectuals, all of whom should properly be called natural philosophers rather than simply and ahistorically scientists. Unlike the sciences that later replaced it, natural philosophy was unified by its search for a better understanding of God, of divine creation in natural historical disciplines, and divine laws in the mathematized disciplines. Dan, Grötzinger, and Liebes have provided suggestive, albeit ahistorical, perspectives that make for a good point of departure. In what follows, I want to explore what, in addition to its optimism, made Lurianism of particular interest to natural philosophers of the 17th century. First, an ahistorical generalization of my own. Divinity objectivized. Here I would combine Liebes's insight into the elimination of any gap between the material and spiritual realms in Lurianism with Scholem's more general characterization of Kabbalah as typically objectivist, or what Buber would disparagingly call Gnostic. Despite the great variety of literary styles and genres in Kabbalah, mystical autobiography is extremely rare, and knowledge of God generally presented in an objectivized manner. This, Scholem emphasized, was very different from Christian mysticism with its emphasis on the subjective experience of the adept. Combine Liebes and Scholem and you get a mythic objectivism in which all of reality, spiritual and material, may be known and described with the unabashed precision that was precisely the aspiration of natural philosophers of this period. Another generalization, not so bad, not too Jewish. Much Kabbalistic literature is devoted to biblical exegesis, speculation regarding the reasons for the commandments, and performative ritual activity. It is inextricably bound up with Judaism and, yes, with Jews. Lurianic literature is no exception, but neither all of Kabbalah nor all of Lurianism was of equal interest, let alone accessibility to Christian readers. I would suggest that the most important works of Kabbalah for natural philosophers were precisely those that were most Judenrein or Judentumrein. The authoritative voices of these objectifying texts do not seek legitimation in the precedents of biblical or rabbinic literature. Invocations of such are rare features of Sefer Yetzirah, the Zoharic Idrot, or the Lurianic Etz Chaim and its parallels. They present a book of God as universal as three-dimensional space. These texts could therefore be divorced with relative ease from Jewish tradition and conscripted for their potential contribution to universal knowledge. According to Paolo Rossi, in the Pansophic ideal which dominated 17th century culture, there was an insistence both on the necessity of possessing total knowledge and on the existence of a single law, key, or language, which would enable one to read the alphabet impressed by the Creator in material things. For the Pansophists, the real world and the world of knowledge formed a unified and harmonious whole and shared an identical structure. All of reality unified in a consistent structural principle. Sounds familiar? Etz Chaim, in short, was a good fit. Compatible lacunae. But it is possible to be more precise. As we consider characteristics of particular expressions of Lurianism in light of characteristics of natural philosophy in the first phase of the scientific revolution, we can do more than point to similarities, we can point to differences. Indeed, in this instance, I would suggest that a key difference between the totalizing universal discourse of Etz Chaim and that of 17th century natural philosophers may have made its assimilation easier than would have been the case had they been more alike. Ronnie Weinstein's recent work has laudably made the case for reading Lurianism in the early modern context. Amidst his enthusiasm for a good cause, however, Weinstein has not always been careful to distinguish the cultural context of mid-16th century Palestine from late 17th century Italy, or between Lurianism and its reception history. He has also focused on similarity, at times in rather forced readings, to the exclusion of difference and what can be learned from it. Pansophism is a case in point. Truly, both Lurianism and early modern natural philosophers aspire to a comprehensive, seamless knowledge of reality, top to bottom, as it were. Putting aside for the moment the question of whether Luria was a precocious pansophist, how did Lurianic pansophism differ? Weinstein presents Luria's pansophism, which he treats under the rubric of encyclopedism, as all-inclusive, from the infinity of Ein Sof through the divine worlds to the material world and down to the lowest realms of the demonic. This may be true enough, but it is no less true that along this vast spectrum there are vast disparities when it comes to real attention and interest. Luria, and it is fair to say most of his Kabbalistic predecessors and subsequent expositors, had little real interest in pursuing knowledge of the material world for its own sake, nor in advancing this knowledge by any of the various means being pursued by his naturalist contemporaries. We look in vain for the Kabbalistic polymath who took equal interest in all aspects of reality, material and spiritual. Chaim Vital's unfortunately incomplete astronomical treatise, Sefer Atchuna, seems typical of his genre, no interest in advancing science, but merely in teaching the astronomy an educated Jew would need to calculate his calendar. This is not to say that Sefer Atchuna did not take its place on the spectrum of Vital's work devoted to describing how everything worked. Indeed, the celestial primer sat adjacent to his treatments of how the divine worked. Quite literally, as a number of extant fragmentary manuscripts of the work are bound alongside his Lurianic treatise Shar HaHakdamot. Vital's alchemical magical manuscript, recently published for the first time, can in turn be seen as occupying the next spot on the spectrum in its earthly, this-worldly, practical orientation. The eclectic and ambitious intellectual agendas of leading early modern natural philosophers, on the other hand, could and did include extensive forays into esoterica and matters of divinity. The Book of God was studied with avid interest alongside the Book of Nature. I cannot therefore quite say that the Lurianic lacuna with regard to the Book of Nature was matched by a 17th century natural philosophy lacuna with regard to the Book of God. What I would suggest, however, is that the Book of God, as represented in Lurianism, was, at the very least, discursively, and as we shall soon see, visually, well matched to sit alongside the Book of Nature as it was being conceived in the early, or to use James Franklin's term, diagrammatic phase of the scientific revolution. Indeed, in the expressions of Lurianism that reached 17th century Christians via Norvan Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denudata, the divine world was represented with geometrical precision to exacting specifications in excruciating detail. They had to love it. But perhaps no less significant was the lack of real interest in the book of nature in Lurianic Pansophism. This gap in the spectrum, this différence, made for easier assimilation. There was no rival Kabbalistic book of nature that came as a package deal with their book of God that had to be countered or suppressed. I've just made a passing reference to the early diagrammatic phase of the scientific revolution and would like to say just a bit more about that as an entree to a consideration of what my recent work on Kabbalistic diagrams might contribute to a history of the interplay between Kabbalah and science in the early modern period. We should define the term. A diagram is a picture in which one is intended to perform inference about the thing pictured by mentally following around the parts of the diagram. It's difficult to use the term scientific revolution, of course, without thinking of the priceless opening of Stuart Chapin's 1996 work, The Scientific Revolution. There was no scientific revolution, and this is a book about it. Chapin clearly earned his place in the world of truth with that opening. Indeed, once that's clear, we can get down to business. James Franklin has stressed a point that could not be more salient to our discussion. The later phase of the scientific revolution is indeed algebraic, but the earlier one is diagrammatic. This may be seen through innumerable examples, from Descartes' conviction that science could be forwarded by ignoring all properties of matter except the pure geometrical, to Leibniz's comment that geometrical diagrams were the most useful characters for recognizing, discovering, or proving truth, to Spinoza's attempt to develop ethics more geometrico, in the manner of geometry, an attempt indicative of a conviction that geometry was the key to much more than mathematics. In short, in Franklin's admittedly somewhat Whiggish view, reasoning with diagrams in the Middle Ages and Renaissance trained Europeans to think adequately to do science. The proliferation of diagrams in medieval scientific literature probably owes something to Roger Bacon's claim that through figures and geometry, we learn per experientiam, through experience. Meanwhile, the conflation of Kabbalah and Pythagoreanism, and of course Platonism, had long been axiomatic among Christians. It figures centrally in the presentation of Johannes Reuchlin and persisted in the minds of 16th century figures including Giordano Bruno and John Dee. Such an identification could only be consolidated and to some extent vindicated when Kabbalah shifted from the eros of the Zohar to the anatomy or astronomy of Etz Chaim. Indeed, should we say the astronomy of Etz Chaim, as Vital himself writes in the book, the structure of the Sfirot in their endless concentric circles may be pictured in the manner of the pictures of spheres as found in astronomical treatises, al derech tmunat hagalgalim haniskar besifrei tochniim. The earliest diagrams in Lurianic works not surprisingly resemble those of mathematical and astronomical works. The internal Lurianic propensity to represent the system is structurally akin to the cosmos, and therefore suited to diagrammatic representation in the fashion of astronomical treatises, determined the conventions of representation within Lurianic literature from its inception to reception, including reception among Christians. It should be noted that celestial-style illustrations were supplemented by and later integrated within more complex graphical presentations that deployed two other conventional modes of medieval scientific diagramming, arbores and tabulae, the trees and tables. The former were typically deployed to classify and analytically divide wholes into their constituent parts, or their constitutive parts, the latter to summarize large bodies of information. Trees and tables survived and indeed thrived in early modern science, as may be observed in the revival of the Lullian image of the tree of science in the works of Francis Bacon and René Descartes. Until approximately the mid-17th century, Lurianic diagrams were very much like those in medieval works of natural philosophy. They served to illustrate specific arguments set forth by some segment, perhaps of only a few lines of text. Moreover, preliminary results of research I recently conducted with my assiduous postdoc Eliezer Baumgarten on Vital's particularly, he's sitting right here, thank you, on Vital's particularly mechanistic presentation of Lurianic cosmology, Otzrot Chaim, seemed to point to an increasing supplementation of diagrams in the 17th and 18th centuries to manuscripts that were originally quite sparsely illustrated. The more ambitious attempts to represent Lurianic cosmology diagrammatically in large scrolls, as well as in codices with fold-out illustration, begins only in the mid-17th century. These are the great Ilanot, that can run 3 meters in length and stretch nearly 1 meter wide, associated with Rabbi Meir Poppers and Rabbi Natan Netta Hammerschlag. From the sporadic and modest medieval-style concentric circles that seem to have been Vital's preferred visual idiom, to the proliferation of detail and synoptic diagramming from the mid-17th century onward, the diagramming of Lurianism would thus appear to have marched in step with trends in natural philosophy. The pensophical differential complementarity I've described above is here plain to see in these attempts to diagram the whole. The impressively large synoptic diagrams, have just a good look at that before I go forward. That's all we're going to get about anything outside of the divine. Like Oxford 1949 or Hammerschlag treat the divine world in great detail. Diagrammatically, the Lurianic manuscripts, of course, much more so. They often include a schematic representation of the spheres that revolve around the earth. Some even conclude with a mapping of demonic subterrestrial realms. There is never, however, significant investment made in the treatment of the sublunar or even the celestial spheres. These maps are of the divine, albeit fashioned in a manner bespeaking the presumption that the divine was susceptible to cartographical conquest. And this is a special slide for the chair of the session. In the end, aesthetics. One last salient feature to consider in this context, aesthetics. And of course, for me, everything's about aesthetics ultimately. On the one hand, we see the very significant developments in scientific representation in the 16th and 17th centuries. The implementation of perspective, the polish and elegance evident in 16th century editions of Vitruvius and Leonardo's notebooks and Dürer's botanical drawings simply have no parallels in contemporary Jewish artifacts. Only a few Kabbalistic diagrams evince anything really aesthetically impressive, let alone contemporary, in their draftsmanship. Early modern astronomical treatises, however, largely retained geometrical modes of representation with long, even ancient pedigrees. Here we'll see in a moment something from Euclid, or an edition of Euclid. Kepler. In many cases, such representations not only remained constant through the scientific transitions of the early modern period, but well into our own day. The spherical presentation of atoms is a stunning example of a mode of representation that's even resisted change in the wake of theoretical developments in the 20th century that should have spelled its certain demise. Indeed, when Kabbalistic lore is diagrammed, it looks very little like the images we come across in the first places someone like me runs to look, the memory palaces or emblems so magnificently analyzed by Francis Yates, Lina Bolzoni, and Mary Carruthers. It does, however, look very much like the scientific diagrams found in early modern editions of Euclid or Sacrobosco, and in the new works of Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus. That Lurianism was a form of esotericism that did not cultivate the emblematic visual representation of other contemporary forms of esotericism may have ultimately lent it a modern aesthetic uniquely appealing to a vanguard like Kepler. Indeed, Raz Chen has recently shown how the geometrical regularities of Keplerian diagrams were central to Kepler's attempt to develop exact scientific representations of the motions of the universe. Kepler was determined to liberate science from the imaginative polyvalence of the emblematic image. Tellingly, though, perhaps not surprisingly at this point in the lecture, Kepler also perceived the Kabbalah in geometrical rather than in emblematic terms, as evinced in his noting that he'd planned a little work, Geometric Kabbalah, which is about the natural things in geometry. It may be the case that Kabbalistic diagrams, in particular the more ambitious arbores, were perceived as more important by Christian than Jewish Kabbalists. At the very least, they may have had fewer compunctions about going public with visual representations of the divine. As Judith Weiss was kind enough to bring to my attention, Guillaume Postel refers in his work to Ilanot as a distinct genre of Hebraica. It's hard to think of a Jewish writer, including modern scholars, who has adopted such a generic classification. We also know that elaborate Ilanot of Renaissance Italian provenance were commissioned or copied at great expense by patrons, among whom were members of the illustrious Medici family. The beautiful, colorful parchment scroll now in Oxford was copied by Yaakov Chevron, a.k.a. Scottish Hebraist James Hepburn. The most ambitious and influential example is, of course, to be found in Noor van Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denudata. Rosenroth published comprehensive ilanot and additional diagrams nearly 2 centuries before Jews would issue slightly anemic versions of similar material. The significance of the diagrams in Rosenroth's presentation seems to have been appreciated by his readers. Henry Moore's Opera Omnia includes his own version of Figure 15 from Kabbalah Denudata. Following up the suggestion made by Yossi Schwartz at last year's conference, I explored Rosenroth's Latin and German manuscripts in Wolfenbüttel, Germany, this past summer, and made some interesting discoveries. Among them, apropos this issue, was a note from Johann Benedict Karpzov II, a former student of Johannes Buxtorf II in Basel and professor of Oriental languages at Leipzig from 1668. In this note, addressed to the pious Lutheran hymn composer Johann Jakob Schütz, Karpzov explains that the recondite speculations of the Kabbalah have been all but impenetrable in the past, not only to Christians, but to Jewish rabbis. Why? Quote, because most of them do not know anything about its Kabbalistic tree, which is the foundation of the whole doctrine. Karpzov continues by noting that Theodoricus Hackspan wrote in his Miscellanea Sacra that he had given up on his plan to provide an explicated Kabbalistic tree because of the great difficulty of the subject matter. Recently, however, Karpzov reassures Schütz that a, quote, highly illustrious man has undertaken in a really heroic way that Christians could not even have dared hope for. The diagrams of this highly illustrious man, Rosenroth, were the subject of my still unpublished lecture from last year's inaugural Inassue conference. In some sense, this year's lecture may be considered a prequel, an attempt to contextualize Rosenroth's unprecedented use of diagrams in the presentation of Kabbalah. I would suggest that Rosenroth's use of diagrams constitutes an expression of his perception of Kabbalah as a germane contribution to the pansophic project of contemporary natural philosophy. Furthermore, the geometrical, astronomical, representational conventions of this tradition may explain an aesthetic enigma that has troubled me for some time. Why would someone with access to Johann Christoph, where is it? Here, come on. Yeah. Why would someone with access to Johann Christoph Sartorius, an artist engraver of real distinction, who embellished the frontispiece of Kabbalah Denudata with an emblematic image of subtle complexity, present diagrammatic representations of Lurianism with hardly any attempt to upgrade them? There is the one tease, the lovely engraving of the head of Adam Kadmon II, but no more. Even the most original sections of Rosenroth's diagrams retain the geometric style of the other diagrams he copied from contemporary Hebrew ilanot. Finally, the innumerable acrostics that suffuse the diagrams could only have heightened the sense that the Lurianic Book of God was written in some kind of Euclidean language. What early modern natural philosophers knew of Lurianism, oh no, go back. What early modern natural philosophers knew of Lurianism, they knew from Noor. Last year I attempted to show the honest antiquarian behind Kabbalah Denudata. Today I've attempted to show how Rosenroth's diagrammatic representation of Lurianism constitutes a juncture where the parallel, evolving discourses of Lurianism and early modern natural philosophy converged en route to a meeting with the makers of modernity, if not modernity itself.